Nazi Alemannia was to be a society unlike any other. That was Hitler's ambition, his dream to lead the greatest nation on earth. Technologically, militarily, scientifically, Alemannia was to be the envy of the world. Berlin, renamed Alemannia, would become the most developed and prosperous city in all of history, its magnificence leaving the famed capitals of empires of old, like Roma and Atenas, a mere shadow in comparison. Yet just those years after his rise to power, Berlin lay in ruins, having been smashed in Allied air raids. Its surviving citizens, living in squalor with most amenities destroyed and supply lines unreliable, were pressed into the defense of a city that was mostly rubble and bodies, while the sound of gunfire and T-34 tanks grew ever closer. Beneath the rubble, in the cramped confines of a bunker built to house the leadership before the end came, Hitler and his Nazi Alemannia seemed symbiotically connected as both faced impending oblivion. This is the story of the final days of the Führer Adolf Hitler. Welcome to Guerras do Mundo. Stay to the end of the Führer Adolf Hitler. Welcome to Guerras do Mundo. Construction on a bunker for the German leadership in Berlin began as far back as 1936, beginning life as an air raid shelter before its role began to be expanded, as Alemannia's situation grew more dire by the end of 1944. Located near the Chancelleria building itself, the bunker comprised of two interconnected shelters, with the original shelter becoming known as the upper or forward bunker, while the second lower bunker, which became the Bunker do Führer, was some 2.5 metros further underground, and was afforded substantial additional protection with a concrete roof being 3 meters thick, intended to prevent all but the heaviest of Allied bombs from penetrating. From here, the Führer and his upper echelons could continue to command Alemannia's war efforts, as well as the defense of the city, as bombs and artillery shells rained down relentlessly above. Communications to forces outside, initially by way of telephone and radio, became unreliable, and the Führer eventually resorted to boys from the Hitler Youth being used as runners, carrying written messages from Hitler to the few remaining officers of the Wehrmacht. One such runner was Armin Lehmann, who just at 16 años would find himself face-to-face with the Führer he idolized. Lehmann recalled later how the belief in the Führer still reigned supreme, even in those bleak final days, remembering, "It never entered my mind even then, as the bombs rained down, that we would lose." Hitler had been forced to take up residence in the bunker on January 16, 1945. Despite propaganda to the contrary, the Führer seldom spent any time in Berlin during the war. But now he was underneath the capital city, accompanied by his mistress, Eva Braun, his mental health slowly deteriorating as a result of stress, the onset of his Parkinson's disease, and a potent mixture of drugs given to him by his personal physicians. A big believer in German technical superiority, he clung to the belief that wonder weapons, like the Me-260, E-2 jet fighter, the V-2 ballistic missile, and the Maus super heavy tank, would reverse Alemannia's fortunes. But this belief slowly detached him from the reality of the situation, with the infrastructure to support such weapons slowly being pummeled into dust by Allied bombers. The bunker itself also served to detach Hitler even further from the real world he was living in. Foi decorado luxuosamente, incluindo uma das pinturas favoritas de Hitler de Frederick, o Grande, e até mesmo possuía uma adega bem abastecida. Protected and cared for by the services within the bunker, the war situation became an almost metatextual affair for Hitler, something that couldn't possibly reach him, but at the same time affected his ability to lead Alemannia's defense as the noose closed in between March and April of 1945. Those he shared the bunker with knew the truth. Era uma prisão de desespero, onde muitos procuravam distrações para o inevitável fim. Martin Bormann, Hitler's much-despised private secretary, became well known for making trips to the wine cellar and indulging in his trademark debauchery with women hiding in the shelter from the Exército Soviético's rape gangs. The decadence of those in the bunker shook the beliefs of even a committed young Nazi like the 26-year-old Lehmann, who saw it firsthand for himself as he was given his messages, and then emerged back into the carnage of the street fighting between the city's defenders and the Exército Vermelho. On one occasion, after witnessing the orgy of sex and alcohol, Lehmann was horrified to find two starving men outside the bunker carving up a wounded horse for food, the poor creature still alive and in pain. Such was the desperation for the ordinary citizen. By the beginning of Abril, 1945, almost 2,5 milhões de soldados do Exército Vermelho had advanced upon the outskirts of the German capital, and within 2 weeks had reached the city's center, despite the determined German resistance. Pelo resto do mês, Hitler permaneceu escondido, com o Exército Vermelho a poucas centenas de metros, desgastando defensores como Lehmann. Além de lutar dentro da cidade, o exército soviético também a cercou totalmente, pois o líder soviético Joseph Stalin não queria que nenhum líder nazista escapasse. This had the knock-on effect of also severing almost all communication with the rest of Alemanha that was technically still under German control to the west. Although the reality of the situation was that many German commanders now found themselves without a Führer who had previously insisted on personally directing much of the war effort. As if this were not enough, Hitler also found his orders to his soldiers inside the city were now also starting to be ignored if those receiving them felt they were suicidal or unreasonable, leading to him suffering a nervous breakdown and declaring for the first time that the war was lost. After this, he began investigating the most reliable method of suicide, leading many in the bunker to feel they were part of a suicide pact. Head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring offered to resume the leadership of Alemanha, feeling Hitler had become incapacitated. But Hitler viewed this as treason and demanded Göring resign from all his posts and be arrested. Later, the bunker received news from, of all places, the British Broadcasting Corporation, in which Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler, the once vaunted head of the SS, had communicated with the Western Allies, and that he believed Hitler to be dead and he had assumed the role of the Führer. Himmler had offered to surrender what was left of Alemanha, but only to them and not the Soviet Union. But this offer was denied. Ao saber desse ato, Hitler, furioso, ordenou a prisão e execução de Himmler por traição. Hermann Fegelein, the SS representative in the bunker who was in custody, having been arrested the day before on charges of desertion, was also shot in the Chancelleria Gardens as a warning to others, despite pleas from Eva Braun, Fegelein being married to her sister Gretel, who was due to give birth in days. Em 28 de abril de 1945, relatórios do bunker indicavam que o Exército Vermelho havia alcançado o Potsdamer Platz no centro da Alemanha, a menos de 1 quilômetro de distância. Even with his mind still reeling from the pressures of his situation and the cocktails of drugs he had been receiving, Hitler knew his time was up, his army in tatters, his capital city destroyed, even his most trusted inner circle deserting him. All that was left for Hitler to do was to make the preparations for his own death, so that in one act of defiance, he could at least to a degree go out on his own terms. Naquela noite, logo após a meia-noite do dia 29 de abril, Hitler casou-se com Eva Braun em gesto de bondade e apreço por seu serviço a ele. Eles pretendiam casar mais cedo, mas a documentação jurídica não estava no bunker, o que fez o advogado Miguel Wagner atravessar as ruas devastadas pela guerra em carro blindado, esquivando-se dos disparos de armas russas para buscá-la. Hitler conheceu Braun quando ela trabalhava como assistente do fotógrafo oficial dele, nos primeiros anos de sua carreira política. Of a middle-class Catholic background, Braun spent her time with Hitler largely out of public view, save for when it suited Nazi propaganda, entertaining herself by skiing and swimming. While she had no significant influence on Hitler's political career or his wartime decisions, she did provide him with a degree of normality in an otherwise extraordinary life, and so kept him grounded when he was prone to fits of fantasy or rage. Loyal to the very end, she refused to leave him in the Berlin bunker, despite suggestions she take her chances and attempt to flee, a degree of loyalty he felt was in short supply as he lived through his final hours. Martin Bormann e o ministro da propaganda nazista, Joseph Goebbels, presenciaram a cerimônia. After a rather modest wedding reception and breakfast, Hitler retired with his private secretary to his office, whereupon he dictated his last will and testament, in which he instructed Joseph Goebbels and Grand Admiral Carlos Bernitz to assume Hitler's roles as Chancellor and Head of State, respectively, upon his death. Ele também organizou o que deveria ser feito com seu corpo e suas novas esposas após a morte, inspirado pelo destino de seu aliado, Benito Mussolini, e sua amante na Itália, para tomar tais medidas. He wished to avoid the last images of Adolf Hitler to be him strung up from a lamppost, like meat in a butcher's shop. Nas primeiras horas do dia 30 de abril, Hitler revisou pela última vez o quadro tático, talvez orando secretamente por milagre de última hora. There was none. German forces in and around the city had been surrounded and were slowly being bled to death. Ninguém podia ajudá-lo agora. A Luftwaffe praticamente deixou de existir, e quase todos os pilotos nazistas mais radicais voaram para fugir dos aliados ocidentais, não querendo ser prisioneiros dos soviéticos. At around 200 hours, Hitler began meeting the members of the staff in the bunker, including a doctor named Ernst Schneck, who had formerly worked at the Dachau concentration camp, where he participated in experiments on men, women, and children. Looking at Hitler, he would later describe the Führer as looking like a diminished, hunched man with shaking limbs, bloodshot eyes, and an expressionless face. The Führer thanked them for their work, and then left the medical staff to engage in one last party, one that was attended by Mrs. Eva Hitler herself. Amidst the celebrations, Schneck left in order to use the toilet and overheard a conversation between Hitler and SS physician Werner Haase, where Hitler explained that he wanted to die at the exact same time as his wife. O plano envolvia Hitler e Eva tomando pílulas de cianeto e atirando um no outro simultaneamente, mas Eva confessou que temia não conseguir atirar em seu novo marido. Fearing that the cyanide might fail, Hitler had tested a capsule on his beloved dog, Blondie, and the animal died almost instantly. Às 600 horas, soldados soviéticos atacaram o prédio da chancelaria, mas foram repelidos. Hitler foi informado que restavam menos de 24 horas até a captura do bunker. An hour later, Hitler followed his wife out of the bunker in order for them to bask in the sunlight one last time. Hitler barely made it to the entranceway before the sound of the war he had instigated forced him to retreat back down for the last time. O casal almoçou mais tarde naquele dia e agradeceu à equipe restante. Embora Hitler tenha antes ordenado que todos lutassem até o fim ou fossem fuzilados como covardes, ele finalmente lamentou e disse a muitos que, ao anoitecer, deveriam tentar escapar em vez de serem capturados pelo Exército Vermelho. Às 14h30, Adolf e Eva Hitler se retiraram para seus aposentos privados e fecharam a porta. It was the last time they would be seen alive. After a few hours, Hitler's valet, Heinz Linger, and Martin Bormann entered the room and discovered their lifeless bodies. The Führer, the man who had instigated the most devastating war in history, who had visited such suffering on an industrial scale upon millions, was dead. According to the men's testimonies, the couple, who hadn't even been married for 2 days, were found sitting on the sofa with Eva to the left of Hitler, who sat sunken over with blood pouring from his temple, having at the very least shot himself. Eva, meanwhile, looked comparatively pristine, but the air smelled of almonds, an indication of the release of hydrogen cyanide. O corpo de Hitler foi envolvido em tapete e levado para o jardim atrás da chancelaria, onde Hitler costumava passear com seu cachorro, Blondie. The pair were doused in petrol and then, with some difficulty, set on fire. The flames soon covered the bodies and destroyed them beyond recognition, eradicating one of the most evil men in history. But while the physical being may have been gone, the legacy of the tyrant lives on in various forms even today. The world was shaped by the heinous acts of Hitler and his underlings. However, our history since then has been one of humanity trying to make sense of just how one man can cause so much devastation, and hopefully how to prevent it from happening again. Sadly, as tyrants and their wars continue to wage on almost every continent, it seems it is a lesson we are yet to fully learn.